I'm Brian Nystrom. I'm a priest at St. John's Episcopal Church in Jackson. I'm a poet and a lover of poetry.
My name is Libby Crews Wood. I've lived in Jackson, Wyoming for over 30 years. For me, poetry is an opportunity to know writers deeply and to share ourselves in any moment of time.
Hello, thanks for joining us for this conversation that Libby and I are going to have together about poetry. Libby is a longtime Jackson resident who is an educator and a poet and a friend of mine. And it's great to be here with you, Libby.
Oh, this is delightful. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like folks who are tuning in to know about you?
Well, I think I don't really consider myself a poet very often. This is a new label that I embrace, and as you introduce me this way, it really pleases me, and I feel like I have a new path ahead.
Well, let me just assure you, you are a poet.
Thank you.
And a good one. And and something else that I didn't know about you until our conversation earlier is you also have a degree in education. Yeah, Libby, why don't you tell us a little bit about your career in education?
Happy to. I have taught for 18 years. And this is actually my last year in the classroom. Oh. I'm making a change in my career path. It's slight. I'll be coordinating after-school programming for our district from this point forward. But I came into education with my daughter, who entered school at the same time. So, she entered kindergarten when I went back to get certified to teach. And I just think it was probably the smartest thing I could have done in terms of not just motherhood, but becoming a person who observes humans and helps them achieve, young humans, forming humans, helps them achieve their own sense of themselves and their ability to express themselves.
Do you work with them in writing programs?
Yes, a lot. It's my favorite thing to do. And in fact, I do believe that I haven't considered myself a poet for so long because I've been in the role of sort of cultivating young poets and writers of all types. So I feel like I'm a teacher of writing and not necessarily a writer myself, but that's changing.
That's great. I love that. So I'm curious how the experience of coming and sharing your poem in our Red Door series, how it felt to you. It's been a few days since we did that, and I'm just curious how the experience was in the moment and maybe also in retrospect.
I love this question. I felt honored to be asked in the first place, and so I had this sense of pleasure, to be asked. An invitation is very let's see, what's the right word? Understanding, and so this poem developed in the time between your invitation and my reading, out of a crisis. My parents' ranch suffered a horrible fire, and I had other poems that I contemplated reading, and then through the experience of visiting my 80-year-old parents and helping them, it just happened that a new poem just crossed the page, and I revised it and shared it. So, you know, I felt understood. I felt embraced, because it was a very difficult experience. It was healing, really, to be able to share that experience, both on the page without an audience, which I think is an important part of what we do, but then to be in this room and that collective, it felt right. And I think the collective is an important part of what the Red Door series is about, coming together without any expectation at all. And, you know, such a wide variety of poets, and I just felt very comfortable. You know, I could have been very nervous because I don't share my work very often, but I wasn't. And I think the process of reading the poem once and then sitting with it in that silence, which spans quite a long time. It sounds like 10 minutes, but
10 minutes can feel like a really long time.
10 minutes can be a long time,
Yeah.
and so I got this visceral sensation of people sharing with me, and I enjoyed it. And then the second time, I felt so much more confident and clear. The poem itself felt clear, and I believe that's what happens with reading the poem twice. I think we sit with it the first time, and the second time, it gains clarity.
I totally agree with you. And then to have that 10-minute space in there to meditate in whatever fashion one chooses to meditate in, I believe that it opens the ears, and I believe that it opens the heart, so that second reading is so much more profound and powerful.
And I like that we listen for what moves us versus the craft itself, you know, which I so commonly pay very close attention to.
Yep.
It's often a particular phrase or a word or the image that, you know, that a stanza might create. And I just think that's, I think that kind of audience experience is very unique.
Yeah.
Because it is more prayerful, it's more spiritual. It connects us more. You know, it's non-judgmental.
I always try to emphasize that idea of listening with our hearts instead of our heads, because most of us who love poetry tend to, I think, be critics. Read or hear critically, because that's sort of how we have been taught the craft, and how to read, how to hear. And I think it's really good practice for me, I know, to kind of shut off that critical narrative mind as best I can, right? And to hear with the heart. And that's why after the poet has read twice and we have meditated twice, I always encourage folks not to make that last few minutes of conversation between audience and poet a question and answer series, but rather have the audience respond to what they felt in response to the poem. So that to me is an interesting and meaningful part of what we do.
It is.
Here. Yeah. Libby, would you share your poem with us?
I'd be delighted.
Thank you.
What could not burn? She must have tottered on a chair to reach the Cristo, to pull the wooden cross from the wall with one hand and grasp his linen-wrapped torso in her other, chanting a silent prayer that the winds would die and the cows would live. She must have read the note again, the one tucked into a split in the plank, the one penned in her mother's hand in 1930, Penitente Morada, 300 years, before carrying him to the truck. making her way through their home like this, choosing what could not burn and leaving what could be missed. She lifted her santos from their arched hollows in the adobe walls. Santiago on his white horse, patron saint of Spain, and in Buyeros, the cowboy. St. Francis and the child, whose little wooden birds make her smile. Even then, the Holy Family, two Guadalupanas, and San Pascual, the round patron of her kitchen. Shrouding each carving in newsprint and towels, she packed them among the legal documents, overnight bags, and the Cristo. She must have prayed for their help, the relics and the firefighters. As she drove away from the smoke and flames blackening the mesa and plains, she must have begged, "Dear God, who will bring the rain?"
What a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
So this poem was written in response to your emotions around the story. I assume your mother told you this story after she had gathered her relics, or is this more of an imaginative description?
Well, I'll tell you, when I read it to her, she wept and thanked me for giving her words, because she could not express what had been going through her head. So in all honesty, I based it on what I unloaded from the truck for them.
Oh.
So
that's wonderful.
in my helping them, restore what, when they returned home, I would take these things out and think, okay, this one, oh, this is what you did? And some I could understand and others I couldn't understand, but as we all know, in a moment like that where you must evacuate, it's very hard to make choices.
Yeah.
And, for my mother, who was raised Catholic, but not so much the doctrine, it was more like the faith of our ancestry. Mm-hmm. So, these relics, this Cristo who had been her mother was given this, he must stand, I'm guessing, 4 feet tall, handmade, over 300 years old. He's exquisite. And my grandmother was given it when she taught in a little one-room schoolhouse in Barney, which I don't even think Barney, New Mexico exists any longer. But they removed the Cristo from the wall of the rectory and gave it to my grandmother as the only gift they could imagine for having taught their children, which is really extraordinary.
Sure is. What a gift.
Such a gift. And, the Catholic faith is just an integral part of our history, and I think it's what ties us together. So, we've said prayers, in moments of crises all of my life, and it might be to St. Christopher, or, my mother is now this extraordinary lover of birds and steward of the land, and so St. Francis and she, they have something going, I know. And so I'm not surprised now, and in the process of writing the poem, there was no surprise really at all that those were the things I unpacked from her home.
And therefore, those are the things that she packed.
Yeah.
And I love the line in your poem where she gathers the things that could not burn. Is that, which are absolutely the things that could burn,
right?
If they were left behind.
Yes.
But she couldn't live with the thought of those particular things burning.
And I do believe it was her prayer. I really think that by saving the Santos and saving the Cristo, and she has this beautiful creche set made by a Native American woman in the area, and I think that was her prayer to God to please let the cattle live.
Did anything burn?
No, only grass. Lots and lots and lots of grass and mesa, But that will return
Yeah.
with rain.
Let's pray for rain.
Yes, let's.
So religious iconography is all over this poem, all through this poem, woven through it. And it occurred to me as I was listening to you this time that it's also all around us here in this little chapel too. This old chapel, our big church here. We don't have any stained glass in it, and we seem to have sort of made up for that with the stained glass that we have in here. The super interesting to me that your mother, the things that your mother chose at in the heat of the moment, that it's mostly religious icons.
Well, I think we could connect it to this very chapel that we're sitting in, too. The big church is beautiful, architecturally beautiful. To lose this little chapel or the one in the park, there's a different feeling that we have, because much like my mother's connection to history, connection to ancestry, I believe, and maybe I'm just expressing my own personal views, but to lose a historical chapel like this would be so heartbreaking. It's irreplaceable.
You're right.
Completely irreplaceable. The patina on these walls,
Yeah.
the glass, that sort of ochre shade that comes through. You can't replace this.
No.
You can't rebuild pews of this. I mean, one could rebuild them, but not the thousands of people who have sat upon them and prayed together.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or meditated together, or listened to a poem together.
Got married, got buried,
exactly.
got baptized. All those crux moments in life are celebrated here.
Yeah.
I read this quote from Stanley Cavell, and I read it shortly after hearing you read your poem at our Red Door, and it resonated with me. And Cavell says, and I think he is speaking about poets and other creative artists in this statement. They turn their attention to their own acts of collecting. That is, what it means for texts or thoughts or words to be put together. They ask, why do we put things together as we do? Why do we put ourselves together with just these things to make a world? And this made me think of your poem, and it made me think of kind of collections in general, like your mother's collections of saints in her home, and then also how poems, basically, if you get right down to it, they're just collections of words. And the question Cavell asks is, how do these collections make a world? And I think that your poem so beautifully describes the world that your mother had created in that home, and then the words that you chose and put together in this poem to honor that, to evoke that. It's like a mirror. I
think, I'd like to speak to working with children to answer this question, because, I think through time, many people have made poetry something that it need not be, something scary, something overwhelming, something indescribable, something inaccessible, and yet
perhaps something precious.
Something precious. And I think that, in working with children to express themselves, it is about the collecting, gathering, whether we, are sitting on a grassy hill and, noting sounds, or or things we see in the sky, or the minutia. The children will find the tiniest of things to write about, and the thing that I have to encourage them to do is to simply let go and let that be. Let what they've put on the page be what it is, be that collection. And I help them. I help them create that sense of rhythm, in a very simple fashion, but with that freedom of just collecting. You kind of wander and you gather and kind of put it on the page and move them around, and it's not so precious.
Right.
It's a lot more fun.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm a narrative poet. I and free verse strictly.
Yeah.
And I think I probably encourage my students as well, because it just invites them to tell a story. I believe that the combination of the collection, the gathering, the moving the words on the page, the sharing of the words in a very sort of familiar setting, where people are familiar with one another, it's informal, then, it's all the more accessible.
And perhaps all the more powerful too, because your poem is not precious in any way, and it could have been. I mean, I think that that's sort of the challenge that we work against as poets is saying things, putting together words that are important to us and hopefully important to whoever hears them or reads them, without becoming like too profound about the whole thing, too precious about the whole thing. And I get the sense from this poem and from you, frankly, that you're very, very, you take this very seriously, and you don't take yourself all that seriously. And that shows through in the poem. It's a poem of beauty and of humility, and it's a beautiful poem.
Thank you.